Wave it through, on my name." The man who said it was used to the words working. I could hear it in the flatness of his voice, the way a key sounds when it has opened every lock it has ever met, and expects this one to give like all the rest. He stood at the foot of my post on the royal quay with the morning sea behind him and a manifest in his fist, and he told me to lift the barrier and let his cargo onto the crowned stones without a search. I did not lift the barrier. I want to tell you what that morning was, because the part most people saw, the part that traveled, the part the gulls and the dockhands and the harbor master's clerk would all be telling differently by nightfall, was the smallest part of it. They saw a shipowner shout at a guardsman who would not move. They did not see the rule the guardsman was standing on, which is older than the key and older than the man's money, and they did not see what was in the hold of the ship he wanted passed unsearched. I saw both. I will tell you both. My name is Corporal Owen Bray, and that season I stood the inner barrier of the Crown Quay at the foot of the sea gate of Holt Mere, a working royal harbor where the household stores came in by water and the king's own galleries received their freight off the tide. It is not a parade post. There is no gravel sweep, no crowd of tourists with their phones. There is salt in the wind that gets into the brass and has to be polished out twice a day, and there is a long stone mole running out to a lighthouse the color of bone, and there is the smell of tar and rope and cold fish that no amount of standing still ever made me stop noticing. I wore the red wool and the bearskin and the white gloves the same as a man on the palace forecourt, because the quay is the palace's threshold by sea, and the household holds it the same. But the work was different. On the forecourt you guard a gate that people look at. On the quay you guard a gate that things come through. And the first rule of that gate, the rule they teach you before they teach you how to present arms, is this: nothing crosses the royal stones unsearched. Not a crate, not a cask, not a coil of rope, not on anyone's name. The man with the manifest was named Vell. I learned the name later. That morning I knew him only by the cut of him, a heavy, well-fed man in a long coat the color of wet slate, with rings on 3 fingers and a watch he kept turning to the light so you would see it. He owned ships. He owned, I would find out, a good many of the ships that worked the Mere and the warehouses that fed them and a fair slice of the men who loaded them. In a harbor town, a man like that is a kind of weather. People arrange their day around him. They learn the sound of his coming, and they make sure the way is clear. He had a ship at the outer berth, a stout coastal trader called the Marsh Lark, low in the water, her deck stacked with lashed crates under tarred canvas. And he had a problem. The Crown Quay had been opened that month to private freight for the first time in a generation, a goodwill arrangement, the household lending its deep berth and its smooth road to the harbor's trade, while the public quay was rebuilt after a winter storm took the seawall. It was meant as a courtesy. It was meant to move grain and timber, and the honest cargo of an honest port across the one good stretch of stone the storm had left. And the courtesy came with one condition, printed at the top of every permit in letters Vell had certainly read. Cargo crossing the royal quay is subject to search by the household, the same as the household's own. He did not want his cargo searched. He told me so, and he told me why, and the why was the most ordinary thing in the world. "It's time, Corporal," he said. He said it almost kindly, the way you'd explain to a slow child. "The tide turns in 2 hours. I've a buyer waiting in the upper town and a crew on overtime I'm paying out of my own pocket while you stand there. My manifest is in order. It is signed, it is stamped, it is mine. Lift the bar and let my men bring it up." "Cargo on the royal quay is searched, sir," I said. "I'll have the customs officer to you directly." I keep my voice level on post. It is not coldness, though it reads as coldness, and that morning I wanted it too. A level voice is a kind of wall. It gives the other man nothing to climb. He had come expecting a wall of stone, and he had found one, and I watched him decide in the space of a breath that it was a wall he could talk down. "I don't need a customs officer," he said. "I need a man with sense to lift a bar. The manifest is the search. It says what's aboard. Crates of dried fish for the inland markets, salt, cured hide. You want to paw through 300 barrels of salt fish on the king's stones while the tide runs out. You want that on your morning. The manifest says what you've written, sir, I said. The search is what's there. It is a small sentence. I have thought about it many times since. The manifest says what you've written. The search is what's there. The whole of that morning is in those 2 lines, and Garanville hated them, because he was a man who had spent a life making the written thing and the real thing the same by sheer weight, by being the one who decided what got written down. On his own key, the manifest was the search, because he was the manifest and he was the search, and he was the man who'd fire you if you said otherwise. He had walked onto a stretch of stone where that arithmetic did not hold, and some animal part of him had felt the floor change under his feet before his mind would admit it. So he did what such men do. He went up the ladder of names. Do you know who I am? No, sir, I said, which was true and which I have always found is the only useful answer to that question. It wouldn't change the search if I did. His face went a shade darker. Behind him, his foreman had drifted up, a wiry man with a clipboard who would not meet my eye, which I noted and set aside. A dockhand stopped coiling line to watch. On the deck of the Marsh Lark, 2 of his crew leaned on the rail, and one of them, a young one, was watching me the way you watch a fire you are not sure is going to spread. I'll tell you who I am, Vell said. I'm the man whose family has fed this harbor for 90 years. I'm the man who keeps the lamps lit in half the houses on that hill. I sit at the table with your harbor master. I dine with men who could have your post for a word. And I'm telling you, corporal, soldier, whatever you are under that hat, to lift the bar. On my name. My name is good on every stone in this town. Not on these stones, sir, I said. He blinked. I do not think anyone had said it to him in a long time, perhaps ever, in just that flat and final way. Not on these stones. They are the crowns. The crowned stones do not know your name and do not care. There is something terrible to a certain kind of man in a thing that cannot be impressed, and I watched him meet it. You'll regret this, he said, and now the kindness was gone and the weather had turned cold. You think that uniform protects you. It makes you a target. I'll have your name and your number, and I'll have your sergeant's, and I'll have a letter on the right desk by noon, and you will spend the rest of your little career wishing you'd lifted a bar for a busy man with a tide to catch. Now lift it. He stepped forward and put his ringed hand on the barrier itself, as if he would lift it himself, as if the wood would know his name where I did not. I did not move and I did not raise my voice. I said, "Step back from the barrier, sir." And here is the thing they did not see, the thing under the thing. While Garanville shouted, I was reading his ship. A man stands a post long enough. He stops looking at the loud thing and starts looking at the quiet things around the loud thing, because the loud thing is usually a curtain. The Marsh Lark sat too low. Salt fish and cured hide are bulky cargo, but they are not heavy cargo. A trader stacked to the rails with fish should ride higher than she rode. She sat down in the water like a ship full of stone. The tarps over her deck crates were lashed too carefully. A man does not double lash a tarp over barrels of salt. You double lash a tarp over a thing you are afraid the wind will uncover. And the young crewman at the rail kept looking from his master's face to the hold and back again. And there is a look a young man wears when he is signed onto something he did not understand and has just begun to understand it. I had seen that look before, on faces a long way from this harbor, in a part of my life I do not often speak of. The look does not lie. So when Garanville told me his manifest was the search, I already did not believe him, and not because of who he was. Because of what his ship told me, which is the only witness that has never once lied to me in 20 years of standing where the cargo comes through. Step back from the barrier, I said again. The cargo will be searched. Then it will cross if it's clean. If you obstruct the search, sir, it won't cross at all, and that will be on your name, not mine. For a moment I thought he might strike the barrier, or me. His knuckles were white on the wood. Then he was clever enough, and I'll grant him that he was clever, to take his hand back, smooth his coat, and put on the face of a reasonable man wronged by a small one. "Get me your sergeant," he said. "Get me a man I can talk to." "Gladly, sir," I said. Because here is the part Vell did not understand, the part that men who buy their way through every gate never understand until the gate is the household's. He thought a sergeant was a man he could talk down where a corporal had failed. He thought the chain above me was a ladder he could climb. He did not know that the chain above me was not a ladder. It was a wall behind the wall, and he had just asked me to bring it down on himself. I lifted the small whistle on its cord, not the loud parade call, the short one, the post call, and I blew the 2 notes that mean a supervisor to the inner barrier, hold position. The notes went out flat over the water and came back off the stone of the mole. Down the quay, a head came up. And the morning, which Vell believed he was about to win, began, very quietly, to turn against him. The first man to come was not a sergeant. It was the customs officer, because the customs officer's hut was nearest, and because the post call is the call that fetches whoever can come fastest, and on a working quay, that is the man whose whole reason for being there is exactly this. Her name was Officer Marin Cole, and she was a spare, gray woman past 50 with a coat as worn as the stones, and an eye that had been looking into other people's cargo for 30 years. She walked up unhurried, with a leather satchel over her shoulder and a brass-tipped gauging rod in her hand, and she did not look at Vell at all. She looked at me. "Corporal." "Officer Cole." "Private cargo for the Royal Quay, the Marsh Lark outer berth. Manifest declared as salt fish, salt cured hide. The owner asks it be passed on his name without search. I've held it for the search." "Have you?" She turned then slowly and looked at Vell, and her face had no fear in it at all, which I think surprised him more than my refusal had. He was used to the harbor master's deference. He was not used to a woman in a threadbare coat looking at him like a column of figures that did not add up. "Mr. Vell," she said, "it's been a while since you brought a load through my shed. Most of your trade goes out the river mouth these days, doesn't it? Past the gauging house. Why's the Marsh Lark come all the way round to the Royal Stones?" "Because the public quay's a building site, Marin, as you well know," he said, and the use of her first name was meant to make her small and did not. "And the Crown opened its berth to honest trade, and mine's as honest as any. The manifest's in order. I've shown the corporal. I'll show you. And then I'd like my cargo on the road because unlike everyone standing about on this stone, I have a living to make." She took the manifest. She read it the way Cole read everything, slowly, her lips not moving but her rod tapping once, twice, against her boot. Then she handed it back. "Paper's lovely," she said. "Let's see the load." "The load is salt fish." "Then it'll take us 10 minutes and you'll catch your tide with time to spare," she said, "if it's salt fish." I have served with hard men and brave men. I have rarely seen anything as quietly immovable as Marin Cole deciding to gauge a hold. She had no rifle. She had a brass rod and a book of law she carried in her head and the whole weight of the Crown's revenue behind her, and Vell, who could have bought her coat 1,000 times over, could not move her 1 inch. He felt it. I watched him feel it. He had brought his ship round to the Royal Quay precisely because he thought the household's smooth new road would be guarded by ceremonial men who knew presenting arms and not gauging, who would wave a manifest through out of ignorance of the trade. He had not counted on the rule that the Royal Quay is searched by the household and the household's customs both, together, the soldier and the officer, the wall and the wall behind it. He had walked his ship into the one place in the whole harbor where his name bought him nothing, and the search was certain. "This is harassment," he said. "I'll have your superiors." "You'll have them quick," Cole agreed. "I'm about to call them myself." She lifted her own whistle and blew the customs call, the 3-note one, and now 2 more things began to move. From the gauging shed, a younger customs man came at a trot with a second satchel. And from up the quay, hearing 2 post calls inside 5 minutes, came the man Vel had asked for in the first place. Sergeant Daw Hollies of the Household Key Guard, my own sergeant, a broad, slow-moving man with a face like a closed door, who took in the scene the way he took in everything, without hurry and without missing a stitch of it. "Corporal Bray," Holly said, "report." I gave it to him in 10 words. Held cargo for search. Owner refuses, demands passage on his name. Hollies listened with his eyes on Garen Vel the whole time, and when I'd finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said the thing I will remember him for. "Did the corporal explain the rule to you, sir?" "Your corporal," Vel said, "is a jumped-up doorman who—" "Did he explain the rule?" Holly said again, not louder, just again, the way you'd repeat a thing to a man who'd misheard. "That cargo on the Royal Key is searched. Yes or no?" A silence. "He did," Vel said, "and it's a small-minded rule for small-minded." "Then he did his duty exactly," Holly said, "and you've nothing to complain of, and we'll have the search and you'll catch your tide. Officer Cole, the hold's yours." Vel tried him the way he had tried me. I will give him this. He did not give up easily, and a man who does not give up easily is harder to be rid of than a coward, but easier to respect, and I respected him for about the length of his next sentence. "Sergeant," he said, warm now, reasonable, 2 men of the world over the head of a stubborn corporal. "You've sense, I can see it. You know how a harbor works. You know what it is to keep a thing moving. Your man here is correct in the small letter of it. I don't dispute it. But you and I both know there's the letter and there's the sense. And the sense of it is that I'm Garen Vel. My trade is 40 years clean across this water. And there's no call to gauge 300 barrels of fish on the King's stones while my crew burns daylight. Pass it on my word and yours together, and I'll not forget the courtesy. I'm a man who remembers courtesy." "I don't doubt it, sir," Holly said. "Here's the trouble. My word doesn't lift that bar either, nor the harbor master's if you sent for him, nor his above him. There's no man on this key whose word lifts that bar, because the bar doesn't lift on a word. It lifts on a clean hold. That's not me being hard with you. That's me telling you how the thing's built, so you'll stop spending your breath looking for the man who can do you the favor. There isn't one. There was never going to be one. Officer Cole, the hold." I watched that land on Garen Vel, and I watched him understand it, and the understanding was worse for him than any refusal. He had come up the key sure that somewhere above the corporal there was a sergeant, and above the sergeant a master, and above the master a man at a good table, and that one of those rungs would be soft, the way a rung always was, the way the whole world had always had a soft rung in it for a man with money and a name. And Hollies had just told him, plainly and without unkindness, that the household is the one structure he would ever meet that is built on purpose with no soft rung in it at all, that the bar does not lift on a word, on anyone's word, all the way up forever, because the whole point of the bar is that it does not. That is a terrible thing to learn at 50, on a cold key, with a false floor under your feet. And that was the moment, if you want to know it, when Garen Vel lost. Not later at the cuffs, not at the hearing. There. On the stone in the gray morning when the sergeant he'd demanded, the man he'd been so sure was a higher rung he could climb, stood beside the corporal instead of above him, and called the rule what it was, and gave the hold to customs. Vel's whole strategy had been the ladder of names, corporal, then sergeant, then harbor master, then the men he dined with, up and up until he found a rung soft enough to lean on. And the household had no soft rungs. Each man he reached for stood on the same stone as the last. The wall did not get thinner as you climbed it. It got higher. He saw it. I'll say that for him. He was a man who could read a turned tide, having made his money on tides, and he read this one. And so he changed. He stopped trying to climb the wall and started, quietly, frantically, looking for a gap in it. "Now wait," he said, and his voice had a different note now, lower, faster. "There's no need for all this. Marin, Officer Cole, look, the manifest may not be, there may be an error in the manifest. A clerk's error. Cargo gets relabeled, you know how it is. A load comes in late and gets written against the wrong bill. If there's a discrepancy, it's an honest one, and I'll pay the duty on whatever's found, gladly, double the duty, and we'll call it a paperwork matter and no more, and everyone catches the tide and goes home. He was sweating now in the cold sea wind. There's no call to make a thing of it. I'm offering to pay. I'm offering to pay double. Officer Cole looked at him for a long moment. A man who's carrying salt fish, she said, doesn't offer to pay double duty on salt fish before the hold's even open. Mr. Vell, I'm going to gauge your ship now. You can stand on the quay or you can stand off it, but you'll not stand between me and a hold I've a lawful call to search. She turned to Hollies. Sergeant, I'd take it kindly if your men kept the deck clear while I work. Bray, Hollies said. Go aboard with the officer. Anyone obstructs her, that's obstruction of a lawful search on crown stones, and it's no longer a paperwork matter. Sergeant, I said, and I stepped off my post for the first time that morning, not because the post was abandoned, but because a second guardsman, Tompkin, had come up at the sergeant's word to take the barrier, and the post is never abandoned, only relieved. That is a thing I have tried to make people understand who think a guardsman standing still is a guardsman doing nothing. The stillness is not the duty. The stillness is the shape the duty takes when nothing needs doing. When something needs doing, the stillness ends and the duty goes on, the same duty only moving. I went aboard the Marshlark with Officer Cole at my shoulder, and the young crewman watching us come, and I felt the deck give under my boots the particular sluggish way a ship gives when she is carrying far more than her papers say. The hold he would not pass unsearched was under a hatch amidships, battened and tarred and lashed, and a man does not lash a hatch over salt fish. Cole had the young customs officer get the lashings off while she stood at the hatch combing with her rod and her book, and Garin Vell stood at the rail with two of the household men either side of him, and watched his whole life come apart one knot at a time. He had stopped talking. There is a quiet that comes over a certain kind of man when the thing he has been outrunning finally catches him, and it is not peace. It is the quiet of a man doing arithmetic he should have done a long time ago. While the young customs officer worked the lashings, Cole did a thing I have never forgotten, because it taught me more about her trade in 2 minutes than a year of watching had. She did not look at the hatch at all. She walked the deck. She walked it slow, from the bow back, tapping her brass rod against the planking every few feet and listening, the way I have heard a doctor tap a man's chest. She stopped over the forward hold and tapped, and the deck rang one way. She walked aft to the hatch we were opening and tapped, and it rang another. She's loaded heavy forward and light aft, she said, half to herself, and a fish run loads even because fish is fish. A barrel's a barrel, you stack it where it lies. A ship loaded uneven is a ship loaded around something. She came back to the amidships hatch and looked down into the dark, and she was not guessing any more. She knew there was a thing. She did not yet know what. That is the difference between a search and a hope. A search is a man who knows there is an answer and means to have it, and will not be told the answer by the man who has the most reason to lie. The hatch came up. Cole leaned over it with her lantern, and I leaned with her, and below in the dark there were the barrels the manifest had promised, ranks of them, salt fish barrels, honest and ordinary and exactly as written, for the first 2 rows. Cole did not even look at the first 2 rows. She had been doing this for 30 years, and she knew that a man who hides a thing hides it behind the true thing, and she went down the ladder into the hold with her rod and tapped the barrels in the 3rd row and the 4th, and they did not ring like barrels full of salt fish. They rang hollow at the top and dull at the bottom, false-headed, a hand's depth of fish over a packed false floor, and below the false floor. I will not make a tale of what was below the false floor, because the wrong of it is not entertainment. It was contraband, goods run past the crown's revenue and worse, goods whose trade is forbidden outright because of the harm it does and the hands it passes through, smuggled in under the honest weight of an honest port, on a ship that flew an honest manifest, across the one quay in the harbor its owner believed too ceremonial to search. That is the whole of what you need to know. Officer Cole knew it for what it was at one glance, and her face, which had been only stern, went grim and old. She came up the ladder slow, and she stood on the deck and she looked at Vell, and she said one sentence. "You brought this across the King's stones." He had no answer. There is no answer to that. He had spent the morning telling me his name was good on every stone in the town, and he had chosen the crown stones to carry the worst thing he owned across, because he had believed the crown stones were the softest. He had believed wrong, and the believing wrong was the whole of his ruin. What happened next happened fast, and it happened by the book, and the book is the thing that mattered, so I'll tell it plain. Officer Cole's authority to seize the cargo and detain the ship was absolute the moment the false floor came up. She did not need the household for that. But the contraband below was the kind that the harbor's own custom shed could not handle alone, the kind that brings other men down to the water in a hurry. And so the calls went out, Cole's to the Revenue Service and the harbor magistrate, Holly's is up the household chain to the Key Watch office and beyond. And here is where the part that traveled began, the part the dockhands would tell wrong. People thought the household rallied to protect a guardsman who'd been shouted at. They had it backwards. The household rallied because a guardsman had held a rule, and the rule held had caught a thing that needed catching, and now the whole apparatus that the rule exists to feed came down to the quay to do its work. Within the half hour, the outer berth was a different place. The revenue cutter that lay always at the lighthouse mole came round and put 2 officers aboard the Marshlark to take custody of the hold. The harbor magistrate's men came down the quay road. A detail of the household Key Watch closed the inner barrier and the road behind it, not against any crowd. There was no crowd to speak of, only dockhands and gulls, but because a crown seizure of forbidden goods is sealed ground until it's logged and witnessed, and the sealing is the household's to do. Sergeant Holly stood at the head of the gangway and oversaw it all with his closed-door face, and twice I heard him say the same flat words to men who came up wanting to know what the fuss was. Lawful search on crown stones. Stand clear and let it be done. And it was done. By noon, the noon by which Vell had promised to have a letter on the right desk that ended my career. The Marshlark was under seizure, her hold logged and sealed, her owner detained, and the tide he'd been so anxious to catch ran out without him, the way tides do, indifferent to every name. They took Vell off his own ship at last, and he went quietly, which I had not expected. At the head of the gangway he stopped, close to me, and he looked at me for the first time as a man and not as an obstacle, and there was no money in his face any more and no name. He said low just to me, "You knew. Before Cole came, you knew, didn't you?" "I knew the ship was wrong, sir," I said. "I didn't know what wrong. That's why we search. So a man doesn't have to know, he only has to look." "I'd have made you rich," he said, "to lift the bar." "I know it, sir," I said, "and I will tell you that I felt no triumph saying it, only a kind of weariness, the weariness of a man who has watched another man spend his whole life building a thing on the belief that everything has a price, and watched the thing come down because, just this once on this stone, it meant something that did not. That's why there's a rule," I said. "So it isn't left to whether a man can be made rich. So it's only ever the search." They led him off. The young crewman from the rail, the one whose look I'd read, turned witness that same afternoon, and it came out at the hearing that he'd signed onto a salt run and learned the truth of the cargo only at sea, and had been sick with it, and his telling closed the last of the gaps the false floor hadn't already closed. Vell's name, which had been good on every stone in the town, was not good on any of them after that. The harbor master he dined with would not see him. The men he'd been so sure could have my post for a word found, to a man, that they had urgent business elsewhere. He went before the magistrate, and then before a higher court for the worse of it, and the ships and the warehouses and the slice of the loading gangs all went to the satisfying of what he owed the crown and the law. And the lamps on the hill stayed lit just the same, lit by other and honester hands, because a harbor is bigger than any one man's weather. though men like Vel never believe it until the day the weather is them. I want to be careful about the part that comes next, because it is the part most stories of this kind get wrong. They want the guardsman to be a hero. They want me to have known, to have planned it, to have been the secret cleverness at the heart of the morning. I was not. I held a barrier. That is the whole of what I did. I held a barrier against a rich man's name and a busy man's tide, and the very reasonable-sounding argument that the manifest was the search, and the rule was small and the load was only fish. The rule did the rest. The rule, and Marin Cole's 30 years, and Daw Holly standing on the same stone as a corporal instead of above him, and a revenue cutter that lay always ready at the mole, and a young crewman's conscience, and the false floor that rang hollow when a brass rod tapped it. The household did not rally to me. I was the smallest part of it. The household rallied to the rule, because that is what the household is, not a wall of one man, but a wall of men each standing on the same stone, so that there is no soft rung anywhere on it, so that a name, however good, finds nothing to lean on, and the search is only ever the search. There is one more part of that morning I have not told, and it is the part I think about most, because it is the part that nearly went the other way. While Cole was still in the hold and Hollies was still sealing the deck, before the cutter came round, there was a stretch of perhaps a quarter hour when it was only us, a corporal, a sergeant, an old customs officer, 2 young customs men, and a handful of household guards standing on a private ship that belonged to the most powerful man in the harbor, who was at that moment promising us, each of us by turn in a low, steady voice, the things he could give and the things he could take. He named sums. He named the men he knew. He told Tompkin, who was 22 and had a mother in the upper town, that he knew her street, knew her landlord, could make her winter easy or hard with a word, and all Tompkin had to do was look the other way for 10 minutes while a thing was put over the side into the harbor mud where no rod would ever find it. I heard him do it. I heard a powerful man, cornered, reach for the one tool that had never failed him, and try to buy his way out one soldier at a time, starting with the youngest. And not one of us moved. Tompkin did not look the other way. He stood his place at the rail with his jaw set and his eyes front, and he did not so much as turn his head, and when Vel finished, Tompkin said the only thing he said the whole morning, which was, "Sir, you're to stand clear of the rail," in a voice that shook a little and did not bend at all. I have been prouder of things in my life, but not many, and not by much. Because that is the test, you see, not the shouting at the start, which any man can stand against, but the quiet offer in the middle, the reasonable, ruinous, particular offer made to you alone when no one important is watching, and the thing he wants is so small, and the reward is so real, and the mud is right there over the side. That is where walls actually fall if they fall, not at the gate. In the quarter hour on the deck when it is only men, and the man with everything to lose starts spending it on you. We did not fall. The wall held in the one place walls are truly tested, which is inside each man on it, where no rule can reach, and only the man himself can keep the post. I have thought since that the rule on the gate is only as good as that quarter hour on the deck, and the quarter hour on the deck is only as good as the men. And so in the end it does come down to men after all, to a sergeant who would not trade his word, an old woman who would not be flattered, and a frightened boy of 22 who would not look the other way for the sake of his mother's winter. The household is a wall of men. But it is a wall of men, and that morning I was glad past telling of the men it was made of. There was a question put to me afterward by a young guardsman new to the quay that I have thought about as much as anything from that morning. He asked me whether I had not been afraid, holding the barrier against a man who could end my career with a letter. The honest answer is that the letter never frightened me, and I'll tell you why, because it is the whole of the thing. A man like Garin Vel believes his name is a force in the world, and on his own ground it is. But I do not stand on his ground. I stand on the crown's stones, in the crown's wool, under a rule the crown made and the household keeps, and when I hold the barrier I am not Owen Bray holding it with my one small career to lose. I am the household holding it, and the household has no career to threaten and no tide to catch and no name to ruin, because it is not a man. It is a wall of men. You can shout at one of us. You can write a letter about one of us. You can promise to make one of us rich. And the next morning there is another of us on the stone, standing on the same rule, and the morning after that another, and the cargo is searched, every cargo on every name forever, because that is the post, and the post does not end when the man does. That is what a uniform is when it's worn right. It is the smallest part of a thing far bigger than the man inside it, and the man inside it knows it, and is glad of it and stands very still, and does his small true part, and lets the wall be the wall. The marsh lark was towed off the royal quay on the next tide, empty, her false floor torn out and logged as evidence. The berth was scrubbed and the seizure unsealed, and the household's courtesy to the harbor's honest trade went on, because the rule had held and the courtesy could be trusted again. That is the thing the rule protects, in the end, the trust that lets a crown lend its stones to a port at all. The grain came across and the timber came across, and 1,000 honest manifests proved out true and crossed in their turn, searched and clean and gone up the road by the tide, and none of it made a story, because honest cargo crossing clean is the most ordinary thing in the world and ought to be, and the rule is what keeps it so. I went back to my barrier. Tompkin handed it off and I took it up, and the gulls came back, and the salt got into the brass the way it always did, and I stood the rest of my watch in the gray morning light with the sea behind me and the lighthouse white on the mole. A dockhand going by touched his cap to me, which they had not used to do, and I gave him the smallest nod a man can give and still mean it, and that was all. I did not feel like a hero. I felt like a man who had stood where he was put and held what he was given to hold, which is the only kind of honor I have ever trusted, the kind that does not need a name attached to it, the kind that is just the search, only ever the search, on every stone forever. Some men spend their whole lives certain that everything will move if you push it hard enough, or pay it enough, or shout your name at it loud enough. And most things do. That is the bitter education that makes a man like Garin Vell, the long lesson that the world is soft, that walls are only men, that men have prices and tides and careers to lose. He had learned it so well that he had built his life on it, and brought the worst thing he owned across the one stretch of stone in the world where it was not true. It was not true on the royal quay. It will never be true on the royal quay. The barrier does not lift on a name. The hold is searched, or it does not cross. I held that rule on a cold morning with the sea at my back, and the household came down to the water not to save me but to finish what the rule began, and a thing that should never have touched the crowned stones was caught before it could pass. That is the whole of it. I was a corporal who would not lift a bar. The rest was the wall I stood on, doing what walls do, which is not to move. He told me to wave it through on his name. I told him not on these stones, and these stones in the end were the only answer that morning ever needed.